You think rent-week winter suppers were just simple Southern comfort food. Think again. In the 1950s South, rent-week supper was hard math, done in cold kitchens with frost. Your grandma counted beans, planned one pot for 3 nights, and saved bacon grease in a jar. She wasn't cooking fancy recipes. She was running a home system that kept everyone fed and calm. Let's rediscover 30 forgotten rent-week winter suppers from Southern grandmas. In January 1954, your grandma kept a pot of pintos going like it was part of the house. Quiet, steady, dependable. The beans weren't just beans. She salted late, after they softened, so they didn't turn stubborn. Then she made the rent-week magic. Pepper vinegar. A jar of vinegar with hot peppers dropped in, sharp enough to wake up the whole bowl. The kitchen sound told you dinner was close. Cornbread batter hit a greased skillet and hissed like it meant business. The first slice was crumbly and hot, edges crisp, middle soft, beans spooned over the top until it went creamy. Not fancy, not weak. Honest food that filled you up and made you feel cared for. And if your grandma saved one thing from this meal, it wasn't money, it was fat. Because the next supper starts with what she scraped out of the pan. Your grandma called it skillet supper because that's all it took. 1 pan, 1 burner, 1 good smell. On rent week, potatoes were the dependable friend. Cheap, filling, and willing to taste like whatever you had. She sliced them thin so they'd fry fast, then slid in onions until they went soft and sweet around the edges. The sound mattered. First a hard sizzle, then a calmer crackle when the moisture cooked off. That's how she knew the potatoes were turning crisp instead of steaming. Salt, black pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika if the tin wasn't empty. It tasted like comfort and patience. Sweet onion, browned potato, the tiniest bite of pepper at the end. And when there wasn't enough meat to count, your grandma didn't panic. She changed the rules with 1 spoon of flour. Your grandma didn't wait for Sunday to make gravy. Rent week didn't care what day it was. She took whatever was left in the pan, just a thin shine of drippings, maybe a browned speck or 2, and turned it into something that tasted like a real supper. She dusted in flour and worked it with a spoon until it smelled toasted and nutty, like the bottom of a biscuit pan. Then came water first, because milk was for children and company, and she didn't waste it unless she had to. The sound told you when it was right. At first it hissed and fought. Then it settled into a steady, thick murmur. That's when she poured it over rice so hot it steamed your face. You didn't feel poor eating it. You felt safe. And the next meal is the one your grandma made when the freezer was empty, but the garden still had 1 stubborn green thing left. On rent week, your grandma didn't throw out the plain vegetables. She turned them into the kind of warm that sticks to your ribs. A head of cabbage went into a pot with a little salt, a pinch of pepper, and just enough fat to make the steam smell like supper instead of struggle. The leaves softened slow, turning silky at the edges, and the kitchen filled with that winter-green smell, earthy, sweet, and a little sharp. She saved the pot liquor like it was medicine. Not because it was fancy, because it was flavor. She'd crumble cornbread into the bowl so it drank up that hot broth, turning into thick, spoonable comfort. You could hear the pot working, soft bubbling, lid tapping like a metronome. And when your grandma wanted that same warmth with a little meat presence, she reached for a can and made the next one. When money was tight, your grandma knew a cheap can could feed a whole table if you treated it right. She'd set rice to cook early, so the house started warming from the inside, steam fogging the window, the lid rattling, that clean, starchy smell rising. Then came the sardines. She didn't call them fancy. She called them necessary. She warmed them in a skillet just long enough to melt the oil and wake up the smell, salty, fishy, honest, then slid in sliced onion until it turned soft and sweet. Over hot rice, that oily sauce sank in like gravy. Black pepper on top, maybe a dash of vinegar if you had it, and suddenly it didn't taste like a can. It tasted like somebody knew what they were doing. And right after this, your grandma always started a quiet argument in the kitchen, cornbread or biscuits, and the next supper depends on which side you're on. Rehook Rent Week is when your grandma's food stopped being recipes and became a plan. Every pot had to do two jobs: feed you tonight and set up tomorrow. Stay close because item 6 is where she turns plain flour and heat into a gravy that tastes rich. Your grandma could make a whole room go quiet with the smell of biscuits baking, flour dust in the air, oven heat breathing out, that warm, toasty scent that made you feel rich for 15 minutes. On Rent Week, she didn't waste sausage. If she had it, it was a pinch, crumbled small, browned hard, then stretched. Milk gravy didn't start with milk. Not on Rent Week. She browned flour in the drippings until it smelled like toasted cereal, then thinned it with water first so the gravy had body before the milk ever showed up. That kept it from tasting thin and sad. When she finally splashed in a little milk, it turned pale and silky, thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. She poured it over split biscuits and watched faces change. Relief first, then comfort. And if you think gravy is the ultimate Rent Week trick, wait until you hear what your grandma did with a bone and a pot that never stopped. In winter, your grandma kept a pot like a promise. If she had a ham bone or a chicken back, it went straight in, because bones don't look like much, but they whisper flavor for hours. The broth started quiet, then turned fragrant, smoky, salty, deep, the kind of smell that traveled down the hallway and told everyone to come home. She chopped whatever was on hand, potato, onion, maybe a wrinkled carrot, and let it soften until it surrendered. Nothing went in at the beginning that didn't need the time. That was her rule. She'd taste with a spoon, then add salt last, like she was correcting the world instead of begging it. It wasn't a recipe. It was a method. Simmer, listen, skim, wait. And when she wanted to make that same pot feel like a feast, she added dumplings, simple ones that changed everything in item 8. Your grandma didn't need meat to make supper feel heavy. She needed steam and timing. She'd stir up a bowl of flour, a pinch of salt, maybe baking powder if the tin still had some, and wet it just enough to hold together. Then she'd drop spoonfuls into the bubbling soup like she was laying down soft stones. The sound changed when dumplings went in. The pot went from a sharp boil to a gentler push, like the broth had thickened its voice. The kitchen filled with that flour and pepper smell, warm, simple, satisfying. She kept the lid on and didn't peek, because dumplings punish impatience. When she lifted the lid, they were swollen and tender, soaking up broth like sponges. One dumpling could feel like a whole meal. 2 felt like a holiday. And if dumplings were your grandma's quiet miracle, item 9 is her louder one, the supper that crackled so hard in the skillet you could hear it from the porch. On Rent Week, your grandma knew how to turn a small amount of fish into a big sound. If it was canned salmon, she stretched it with cornmeal or crumbs, onion, and pepper. If it was whatever someone brought home from the river, she treated it the same way: mix, shape, fry. The skillet told the truth. When patties hit hot fat, they snapped and crackled like fireworks, and the whole house suddenly smelled like supper, meant business. She fried them until the edges browned dark and crisp, the inside staying soft. A squeeze of something sharp, vinegar, pickle juice, whatever was around, made it taste brighter than it had any right to. She served it with something plain so the patties could shine. And right when you thought she'd used up her best tricks, your grandma pulled out the sweetest rent week strategy of all in item 10, breakfast food turned into dinner. Your grandma knew the psychological trick rent week required. Give people something that feels like a treat, so she made pancakes for supper, even when eggs were gone. Flour, baking powder, a little sugar if there was any, and water or thinned milk. The batter wasn't fancy, but the smell was pure comfort. Warm griddle heat, toasty edges, that faint sweetness that made winter feel less hard. The first pancake always told her if the pan was right. If it stuck, she waited. If it browned too fast, she backed the heat down. She wasn't guessing, she was listening. When they came off the skillet, she stacked them high so the steam stayed trapped, softening every layer. Butter if you had it, syrup if you didn't, sometimes a spoon of jelly thinned with hot water. It wasn't dinner pretending to be dessert. It was your grandma buying peace for one night. And now we're moving into the next stretch, items 11 to 20, where rent week gets tighter, and your grandma's suppers get smarter. If you ever ate breakfast for supper and felt safe, you already know this truth. Your grandma used comfort as medicine. Now we're moving into the next stretch, where the meals get tighter, smarter, and more filling. Item 11 starts with beans and ends like a full dinner. On rent week, your grandma didn't make soup. She made something thicker, something you could ladle, then spoon, then mop up with bread like it was the last rule of dignity. In a 1950s winter kitchen, the pot started with what the house could spare. Dried white beans that had been soaking since morning, and a couple of potatoes that were starting to look tired in the bin. She put the beans on first, because beans don't respond to panic. They respond to time. The stove talked while they cooked, little pops, a steady simmer, the lid clicking now and then like it was counting down until everyone could eat. When the beans finally softened, your grandma slid in potatoes cut bigger than you'd expect. Big pieces meant they wouldn't disappear. They'd hold their shape and make the bowl feel generous. Then came the rent week trick. She made soup gravy. A spoon of flour stirred into a small cup of cool water, poured in slow while the pot was murmuring. The broth turned cloudy, then creamy, then silky. It wasn't fancy cream, just thick warmth that made your tongue believe there was more in it than there really was. Salt came late, pepper came confident, and if she had it, a pinch of ham seasoning or a scrap of salt pork. Not enough to brag about, just enough to perfume the whole pot. You could smell it before you saw it. Starchy steam, pepper bite, that faint savory note that made the room feel calmer. Beans split soft, potatoes buttery, broth clinging to the spoon. This was how your grandma fed a family without admitting the money was gone. And once everyone quieted down, she reached for the skillet, because the next supper wasn't simmered. It was loud. Your grandma knew cornmeal could be dinner if you treated it like it mattered. On the tightest winter weeks, she made cornmeal mush early, because the secret wasn't the mush. The secret was what it became after it cooled. She whisked cornmeal into salted water until it thickened, stirring until her arm got tired, and the pot started making that slow, heavy plop sound, thick enough that it held the spoon upright for a second. Then she poured it into a pan and left it on the counter to set, the surface steaming, smoothing itself out like a quiet promise. Later, when the house got hungry again, she sliced it into slabs and slid them into a hot skillet with a little grease. That's when it turned from poor to powerful. The kitchen filled with the smell of toasted corn, warm, nutty, almost sweet, and the edges browned into a crackling crust. You could hear it from the other room, that steady frying sound that made people drift closer without realizing they were doing it. She served it two ways, depending on what the pantry could tolerate. savory if there was anything salty to spare, pepper, a splash of pot liquor, maybe a spoon of beans on top, or sweet if she needed to calm everyone down, syrup stretched thin, sugar sprinkled light, butter only if it wasn't already spoken for, crisp outside, soft inside. It tasted like winter survival dressed up as comfort. And it came with a lesson your grandma never said out loud. If you can make something twice, you can make it last. And speaking of making things last, the next supper is what she cooked when all she had was flour, fat, and a little bit of heat to prove a point. When rent week hit hard, your grandma didn't wait on an oven. She didn't need one. She made hot water cornbread, because it was fast, filling, and it tasted like she still had control of the house. She poured boiling water into cornmeal and stirred quick, the steam rising up into her face, the mix turning thick and smooth like wet sand. Salt went in. Then she shaped the patties with hands that didn't flinch at heat. That's the part people forget. Hot water cornbread isn't delicate. It's confident. She slid those little cakes into a skillet with just enough grease to make them sing. The sound was the announcement. A sharp sizzle the second the batter touched the pan, then a steady crackle as the crust formed. The smell was corn and heat and comfort, warm and toasted like the best parts of a summer field brought inside for winter. She flipped them when the edges turned deep golden, not pale, because pale meant you weren't serious. She paired it with greens when she could, collards or turnip greens cooked down until they were tender and dark, with pot liquor that tasted like salt and earth. The cornbread's crisp crust soaked it up. One bite was crunchy and hot. The next was soft and savory, the green bitterness balanced by corn sweetness. That plate didn't look like struggle. It looked like tradition doing its job. Your grandma didn't call it minimalism. She called it supper. And if you think cornbread is the best thing cornmeal can do, the next one will surprise you, because your grandma turned leftovers into a meal that felt like company was coming. Your grandma treated leftover rice like a second paycheck. On rent week, nothing that could become dinner was allowed to die in the back of the pot. Cold rice went into a bowl, broken up with a fork, and then into a skillet with onion, because onion can make anything smell like it's worth eating. She warmed a little fat first until it loosened and shimmered. Then the onion hit, and the kitchen woke up, sweet, sharp, and comforting all at once. The rice followed, spread flat, and she didn't stir too much. That was the trick. If you keep poking it, it stays soft. If you leave it alone, it browns. And browned rice is how a rent-week meal starts tasting like you meant to make it. The skillet made that low crackling sound as the bottom crust formed, and your grandma listened for it like a signal. Pepper went in, a pinch of salt, and if she had a scrap, just one, she chopped it small. A bit of bacon end, a spoon of canned meat, even a leftover fish cake crumbled in. Not enough to call it meat and rice, enough to perfume the whole pan. She served it hot, edges crisp, middle tender, onion sweet. It tasted plain at first, then deeper as you chewed, like toasted bread. If someone complained, she'd look at them like they were forgetting who paid the rent. And right after this kind of supper, your grandma usually pulled out the jar, the one that could turn scraps into a whole new meal. In a 1950s southern winter, your grandma kept at least one jar in the pantry that could rescue a plain bowl. Chow-chow, tangy, sweet, sharp, like pickles with attitude. When rent week tightened the menu down to beans and bread, Chow-chow made it taste like there was a plan. She'd ladle beans into a bowl, pintos, white beans, whatever had softened and held together, then spoon chow-chow right over the top. The vinegar hit first, bright and waking, then sweetness followed, then the crunch of chopped vegetables that still had some life in them. It cut through the heaviness of the beans and made the whole bowl feel less like survival and more like dinner. Cornbread came alongside because your grandma understood balance. The cornbread cooled the vinegar bite, and the chow-chow kept the cornbread from tasting flat. One bite would be soft and warm, the next would pop sharp and tangy, like the pantry had secrets you didn't know about. This was also one of your grandma's quiet lessons in pride. You don't have to apologize for simple food. You just have to season it like you mean it. Chow-chow wasn't decoration. It was a tool. It told everyone at the table that even on rent week, the house still had rules. And once you tasted vinegar-bright comfort like that, the next supper makes sense, because your grandma took the same idea and did it with something even cheaper than beans. Chow-chow wasn't just flavor. It was your grandma saying, "We still have standards." Rent week didn't get to make the house feel plain. Next, item 16 is the quiet supper, onion broth and toast, where she turns almost nothing into warm and steady. Some rent week nights in winter, your grandma didn't pretend the pantry was full. She made a meal that admitted the truth and still felt warm. Onion broth and toast, what some folks called sopper, wasn't fancy, but it was real. She sliced onions thin and let them sit in a little fat until they softened and started to brown at the edges. That smell, sweet onion turning deep, could make a kitchen feel safe all by itself. Then she added water and let it simmer until the onions gave up their flavor and the broth tasted like something earned. Salt went in slowly. Pepper went in like confidence. Toast mattered. She toasted bread hard, not soft, because soft bread dissolves into sadness. Hard toast could take heat and hold its shape long enough to feel like food. She'd put the toast in a bowl and pour the hot onion broth over it, and the bread would soften just enough to become tender without turning to mush. The first bite was steam and salt and onion sweetness. The second bite was comfort. Your grandma didn't call it soup. She called it supper, and she served it like it counted. And when you thought there was no way she could make a no-meat night feel heavier than this, she brought out a skillet and proved it with the next one. Your grandma knew creamed corn could cover a lot of lean days. In winter, canned corn was a kind of stored sunshine, and on rent week, she used it like a main dish. She warmed it slow with a little water or a splash of milk if there was any, then thickened it so it didn't feel like a side. The thickening was quiet but important, just a dust of flour stirred smooth or a spoon of cornmeal whisked in to give it body. The smell turned sweet and warm, like corn pudding without the eggs. Pepper gave it backbone. Salt brought it into focus. And if she had a pinch of butter, she used it late so you could taste it. She poured that creamy corn over split biscuits, and the biscuits soaked it up like they were made for it. Soft bread, sweet corn, warm pepper. Simple, but it landed in your stomach like security. This was the kind of meal that made you forget to ask for meat. Not because you didn't want it, because your grandma had already taken care of the craving in a different way. And right after a soft supper like this, she usually made something crunchy, because the next one is all about sound, not looks. Even in winter, your grandma could find something green that needed using. A few firm tomatoes, late ones, stubborn ones, could become supper if you knew what to do. She sliced them, dusted them with cornmeal, and dropped them into hot grease. That sound was the point. Fried green tomatoes weren't quiet. They crackled and popped, and the smell was sharp and comforting at the same time. Cornmeal toasting, tomato tang rising, pepper in the air. She fried them until the crust turned golden and the edges got crisp enough to hold. But the real rent week trick was what she served them with, gravy dip. Not a full gravy, just a small pan of drippings thickened quick, enough to give each bite a warm, savory finish. Tomato tang, corn crust, then that soft gravy slide. It felt like a meal you'd pay for, even if it came from almost nothing. Your grandma didn't romanticize it. She just served it hot and watched everyone hush. And when you think you've seen every way she can fry her way through rent week, the next supper switches gears because it's baked, humble, and somehow feels like Sunday. On the coldest rent week evenings, your grandma liked a dish that could sit in the oven and warm the whole house while it cooked. Rice and tomato bake did exactly that. She stirred rice with canned tomatoes, a little onion if she had it, salt, pepper, and enough water to let the rice swell and drink everything up. As it baked, the kitchen smell changed in stages. First, sharp tomato steam, then deeper, sweeter notes as the edges browned and the rice started to toast on top. That browned top was a prize. It meant the dish wasn't just soft, it had texture. She didn't waste meat on it. If there was any, it was a few crumbs, a spoon of bacon drippings, a chopped sausage end, something small that made the whole pan taste bigger. She'd pull it out when the rice was tender and the top had those darker spots, then let it rest so it could set into slices. It tasted warm and tangy and filling, and it made a plain table feel organized. And after a dish like this, your grandma always brought the conversation back to one question. What do we still have in the pantry? Because item 20 is the rent week supper built from the answer. Your grandma didn't need a lot to make split peas taste like they had history. On rent week, history mattered, because it reminded you the tight times weren't personal failure, they were weather. She rinsed the peas, dropped them into a pot with water and onion, and set them to simmer like she was setting the whole house back on its feet. The kitchen smell came on slow. Warm starch, soft onion, pepper waking up in the steam. Steady, humble, dependable. Split peas break down on their own if you give them time, and time was the one ingredient rent week always demanded. As they cooked, the pot changed texture like it was learning to stand up. First it looked thin and greenish, like it might not amount to much. Then the peas softened, split, and dissolved into a thick greenish-gold puree. The sound slowed down, too, from active bubbling to a heavier, slower plop, like the soup was getting serious and didn't want to be rushed. Your grandma stirred from the bottom, not gently but faithfully, scraping the pot because burnt peas ruin morale fast. Rent week can survive hunger. It can't survive disappointment at the table. She knew when it was right by the way the spoon came out. If it ran off like water, she waited. If it clung and left a clean trail when she dragged the spoon across the surface, she nodded like a judge. Then she did the most important part, the shine. Not a lot, just enough to change the whole story. A spoon of drippings saved in a jar, a tiny scrap of ham if she had it, sometimes nothing but a little pork fat she'd been guarding for exactly this moment. That little bit melted in and moved across the top in glossy ribbons, and suddenly the soup smelled deeper, savory, rounded, like it had been cooking with more than peas and onion. Pepper woke it up. Salt came last, because your grandma knew salt early can make a pot taste harsh, and harsh food makes people feel poorer than they are. If she had cornbread, she served it beside the bowl, so you could drag a bite through the soup and come up with something thick enough to count as comfort. If she didn't, she used crackers and let the crunch do the work. Either way, it was always hot, hot enough to steam your face, hot enough to quiet the room. It was the kind of meal that made you stop thinking about what you didn't have and start thinking about how your grandma kept the house steady anyway. And now we cross into the last stretch, items 21 to 30, where your grandma's rent week suppers get longer stories, bigger steaks, and the strongest winter tricks she had. Now you're at the point in rent week where most people would panic. Your grandma didn't. She leaned harder on time, sound, and the little shine of fat she saved on purpose. Item 21 is where she makes chicken and dumplings without needing a whole chicken. On rent week in a 1950s southern winter, your grandma didn't need a whole chicken to make chicken and dumplings. She needed the idea of it. Sometimes it was a couple of bony pieces from the market, sometimes a saved back or neck, sometimes just broth she'd been guarding like it was money. She'd start the pot early because this meal wasn't about speed. It was about the house slowly turning warm, one quiet hour at a time. The first smell was gentle and honest, onion sweating in a little fat, pepper blooming, that faint poultry note rising as the water took on color. The kitchen would fog at the windows while the pot worked. Your grandma skimmed the top when it needed it, not because she was being fancy, but because she didn't want the broth to taste tired or look cloudy. She salted late, always late. Salt too early made everything taste sharp, like you were admitting defeat before the food even had a chance to become itself. She let the chicken give what it could. She didn't chase big chunks. She chased depth. The broth got stronger the longer it went, and the sound changed with it, from lively bubbling to a steadier, slower push, like the pot had settled into purpose. When she lifted the lid, the steam smelled like pepper, onion, and something almost sweet, like the kitchen was quietly insisting everything was going to be all right. Then she made dumplings the way she made decisions, simple and firm. Flour, a pinch of salt, maybe baking powder if she had it, and just enough liquid to bring it together. She worked the dough only until it behaved. Overworking made dumplings tough, and tough dumplings ruined the whole point of comfort. She rolled them thin or dropped them thick, depending on who was at the table. Thin dumplings meant more pieces, more bites, more people feeling like they got plenty. Thick dumplings meant warmth that stayed with you, soft pillows that held heat, and soaked up broth like they were built for winter. The sound told you when it turned into supper. Before the dumplings, the pot bubbled like plain soup. After they went in, it changed. Heavier, quieter, a steady murmur like the broth had found a backbone. When you lifted a dumpling out, it steamed your fingertips and smelled like flour and pepper and home. The dumplings weren't just filling. They were proof your grandma could make abundance out of technique. She served it in bowls so deep they felt like protection. Broth clung to the dumplings. A shred of chicken, just a little, made the whole thing taste like more than it was. People got quiet when they ate it, not because they were sad, but because the warmth did the talking. And once your grandma proved she could make a feast from almost nothing, she went to the skillet next, because item 22 is where she turned crumbs and leftover meat into something that sounded like it belonged in a restaurant. Your grandma could make meat happen even when there wasn't much of it. On rent week, she didn't waste the last crumble of sausage or a scrap of fatback. She stretched it the way she stretched every hard week, with cornmeal, crumbs, and heat that knew what it was doing. This was the kind of supper that didn't ask permission to be satisfying. It just showed up loud and golden and made the kitchen smell like you had more than you did. She took yesterday's cornbread, dry at the edges, a little stale in the middle, and crumbled it fine. The smell of corn dust rose up as she worked it between her fingers, breaking big pieces down until they looked like meal again. Then she added whatever meat she had, chopped small enough that every bite could find it. That was the rule. Nobody gets a meatless patty. Onion, if she had it, and she usually did, because onion can fake richness better than almost anything. Black pepper, like a promise. Sometimes a splash of water, sometimes a small pour of milk, if it wasn't already claimed for breakfast. Just enough to bind, nothing more. The goal wasn't softness. The goal was structure, something that would hold together in the pan and come out looking proud. The skillet came first, warming until the grease loosened and started to shimmer. Your grandma didn't rush that step. If the pan isn't ready, the food turns heavy and sad, and rent week can't afford sad. When the patties hit the skillet, they announced themselves. Sharp sizzle, fast crackle, the smell of browned corn and meat drifting through the house like a lie you wanted to believe. The outside browned into a crust that felt like real food, not a substitute. The inside stayed tender and warm, corn sweet with little pockets of savory where the meat hid. She didn't flip too early. Early flips tear the crust and leak the confidence out of it. She waited until the sound changed, until the frantic popping settled into a steadier fry, then turned them once and left them alone to finish. The edges got dark gold, the centers firmed up, and the whole kitchen felt calmer just from the smell. Your grandma didn't plate it fancy. She put it beside greens or beans or a scoop of rice and called it supper. But you knew what she was really doing. She was giving everyone the feeling of having something special, something you didn't have to apologize for. A dinner that didn't look like rent week, even if it was built from it. The taste came in layers. First, the crisp edge, then the corn sweetness, then pepper, then, if you were lucky, that little burst of meat that made you close your eyes for a second and forget rent existed. And right when you thought she'd used her last trick to create meat, she went to the pantry and pulled out the next rent week miracle. Because item 23 starts with a can people look down on now, but your grandma knew how to make it taste like winter comfort. On rent week, your grandma wasn't trying to impress anybody. She was trying to keep the house steady. That's why she loved suppers built from shelf-stable things, beans, tomatoes, and one small can of something meaty to convince everybody this was a full meal, not a compromise. If she had time, she started with navy beans, soaking until they swelled and softened at the edges. If she didn't, she still made it work, cooked longer, watched the pot closer, and kept the heat gentle so the beans didn't split into nothing. The pot warmed the kitchen slowly, and that smell, plain, starchy, calm, was its own kind of security. In winter, a simmering pot made the whole house feel less empty. Then she opened canned tomatoes, and the supper changed color and attitude. The broth went from pale to red, from quiet to awake. Tomato brought brightness, tang that cut through bean heaviness and made the steam smell sharper, cleaner, like it could push back the tiredness rent week brings. Your grandma didn't dump seasoning in like she was guessing. She built it, pepper first, so it could bloom in the heat. Salt later, because beans and tomatoes both lie until they cook down. Then came the Vienna sausage coins, not a whole pile, never a whole pile. Your grandma sliced them thin on purpose, because thin slices mean more pieces, and more pieces mean everyone feels included. She dropped the coins in near the end so they warmed through without disappearing. As they heated, the pot picked up that salty, smoky note that makes a kitchen feel like real dinner is happening, even if the can was small. The sound of the pot stayed gentle, a steady murmur. She stirred from the bottom so nothing stuck, scraping slow, like she wasn't just saving food, she was saving the mood of the room. If the broth got too thin, she let it simmer uncovered until it tightened. If it got too thick, she loosened it with water, because your grandma knew thickness is comfort, but scorch is disaster. When she ladled it into bowls, it smelled like warmth with a little pride. Beans tender enough to mash with your tongue, tomatoes turning the broth rich, sausage giving it that finish that quiets complaints. You ate it with bread or cornbread, dragging the last bit of sauce across the bowl like you didn't want to waste the proof that supper showed up. The first bite was tangy, the second was savory, the third was just comfort. Your grandma didn't call it cuisine, but she understood the psychology. Rent week makes people anxious. A pot like this steadies the house. Your grandma loved meals that cooked themselves once you set them right. On rent week, time was expensive too, and winter made everything take longer. Getting kids bathed, keeping coats dry, keeping the house from feeling like a cold hallway. So she made an oven rice supper that filled the whole place with smell while she handled everything else. Laundry in a steamy kitchen, dishes clinking in the sink, the quiet work nobody thanks you for. She started with rice in a baking pan because rice was dependable and it didn't complain. Then she built flavor the way she always did, with what was left. A spoon of pork drippings saved in a cup by the stove. If there was a scrap of salt pork, She diced it small so it could perfume the whole pan instead of feeding only one plate. Onion went in chopped fine because onion disappears into rice and leaves only sweetness behind. Water poured in measured by instinct, not by cups. Pepper, always. Pepper was how your grandma made plain food speak up. Sometimes she added a little canned tomato for tang if the week felt too heavy, but plenty of nights she kept it plain and let the drippings do the talking. When it went into the oven, the house changed. The air warmed slow, the way it does when heat has somewhere to settle. At first it smelled like wet starch and onion steam. Then the drippings melted through and the smell deepened, savory, toasty, a little smoky, like the kitchen had decided to be generous even when the budget wouldn't. After a while, the top started to dry and brown in scattered spots. Those browned places were the prize. Your grandma knew exactly where they'd be, and she didn't stir because stirring steals the prize. She let it bake until the pan smelled done, until the onion sweetness turned into something roasted, and the rice on top made that faint crackle when you tapped it with a spoon. That smell pulled people in. Somebody would wander through and ask, "Is it ready yet?" Like they were only checking on dinner, but really they were checking on comfort. When your grandma pulled it out, the rice was set enough to scoop clean. The top crackled faintly, the bottom stayed tender and steamy, and every grain tasted like it had been cooked in something richer than it was. That's what drippings do when you respect them. It tasted like meat had been there, even if it barely was. It tasted like planning. Your grandma understood something most people forget. When money is tight, meals get heavy. Beans, rice, cornbread, warm and filling. Yes, but after a few rent-week nights in a row, the table can start to feel sleepy. Winter makes it worse. The air is still, the house is closed up, and everything tastes like the same soft, brown comfort. That's why your grandma made vinegar slaw on rent week, even when it was cold outside. Not as a side, as a reset. She shredded cabbage thin, the knife tapping a steady rhythm on the board, and salted it lightly, not to make it salty, but to tame it. She let it sit until it softened and released water, that sharp green smell rising like you'd opened a drawer full of winter. Then she squeezed it with her hands, quick and sure, and you could hear the cabbage creak and collapse. Vinegar went in next, and the kitchen woke up. A pinch of sugar, if she had it, not enough to make it sweet, just enough to round the bite so it didn't feel harsh. Black pepper. Sometimes onions sliced so thin it almost disappeared. Sometimes celery seeds, if that was the kind of pantry your grandma ran. She stirred it and let it rest, because vinegar needs a minute to settle into the cabbage and turn it from raw to ready. While the slaw sat cooling itself into crispness, the beans stayed hot on the stove. Your grandma kept them steady, not boiling hard, just a quiet simmer with that low, familiar murmur. The smell was soft and starchy and safe. She didn't overseason. Rent week doesn't leave room for mistakes. She tasted, corrected with salt late, and kept the pot warm like it was part of the house. Then she served it the way she meant it to be eaten. Hot beans in one bowl, cold slaw on the side, cornbread ready to catch whatever fell. You'd take a spoon of beans, soft, warm, steady, then a fork of slaw, cold, crunchy, bright, and the contrast woke your whole mouth up. The vinegar cut through the heaviness like clean winter wind coming in the back door. Suddenly, the beans tasted richer instead of repetitive. Suddenly, the cornbread tasted sweeter. The whole plate felt deliberate, like your grandma was proving a point. Being broke doesn't mean you eat dull. This wasn't a salad. This was strategy. A way to keep rent week from tasting like one long beige compromise, and a way to keep everybody at the table feeling awake enough to laugh, talk, and ask for seconds. That vinegar snap is how your grandma kept rent week from tasting dull. She knew brightness keeps people awake and grateful, but now she's about to change the whole mood with sound. Hot grease, crisp edges, street smell comfort. Item 26 starts crackling the second it hits the pan. There were nights your grandma could feel the house getting restless. Rent week does that in winter. People get hungry earlier. They ask questions they don't mean to ask. They open the pantry like it might have magically refilled since yesterday. That's when your grandma made fried batter cakes. Simple, cheap, loud, and comforting, because a hot skillet can settle a room faster than any speech. She mixed flour with baking powder, a pinch of salt, and just enough water or thinned milk to make a thick batter. Not pancake thin, thicker, because thicker means it fries crisp and stays hot longer. If she had sugar, she used a little. If she didn't apologize. The skillet mattered more than sweetness. She let the grease heat until it moved like it was alive, then tested it with the tiniest drop of batter. If it didn't snap right away, she waited. Your grandma didn't throw food into a pan that wasn't ready. Rent week didn't allow waste. When the batter hit hot grease, it sang. A sharp sizzle, then a steady crackle, and the kitchen filled with that smell of fried dough, warm, toasty, irresistible. The edges set first, turning golden, then deeper brown. The surface bubbled like it was breathing. Neighbors might not know what it was, but they knew something was cooking. Your grandma flipped them at the exact moment the sound changed, when the frantic popping calmed into a smoother fry, because early flips make them greasy and sad, and rent week doesn't forgive greasy. She stacked them on a plate so the steam stayed trapped, keeping the centers tender while the outsides stayed crisp. The first bite always made a small mess. Crumbs, heat, a little oil on your fingers, because this wasn't polite food. This was be quiet and eat food. Now came the rent week syrup trick. Syrup was expensive, so she stretched it. A spoon of syrup thinned with hot water, sometimes a little sugar dissolved into it if she needed it to feel like enough. She warmed it just slightly so it poured easy and coated everything. It wasn't fancy, but it turned plain fried cakes into something that tasted like a treat, and treats matter when money is tight. Sometimes she added a pinch of salt to the stretched syrup, just a touch, because salt makes sweetness taste louder without using more sugar. Bake. Your grandma could look at 3 small leftovers and see one whole supper. A little cooked cabbage that was too soft to feel exciting. A spoon of beans that wasn't enough to serve on its own. Some onion, maybe a few potatoes, maybe a lonely carrot coin. Nothing that looked like pride until she decided it was going to become one meal with one name and one hot smell. She didn't call it leftovers. She called it a plate pie, like it was something you made on purpose. She greased a skillet or a baking dish like she was laying down a boundary. Then she layered what she had, not randomly. Then she layered what she had, not randomly, but with logic that came from winter and rent week. Starchy things first, so they held heat and gave the bottom some body. Softer vegetables next, so they wouldn't burn before the center got hot. Beans went in like mortar, filling gaps, thickening the whole idea. Salt and pepper, always, because your grandma refused to let hard times taste bland. If she had a spoon of drippings, she melted it over the top and watched it disappear into the vegetables like a secret getting passed down. It wasn't fat for flavor, it was flavor for morale. Then came the quiet trick, a simple batter. Cornmeal and water, or flour and water with a bit of baking powder, just enough to pour, not enough to be cake. She didn't want a crust you had to fight. She wanted a topping that set like a blanket, turning scraps into slices. When the batter hit the warm pan, it smelled like raw meal and possibility, and when it started to bake, the smell turned toasted and comforting, like cornbread trying to become something else. In the oven, the whole house warmed. Steam rose from the edges, and the kitchen filled with blended smells: sweet cabbage, onion, pepper, toasted batter. The top browned in spots, the edges crisped, and those browned corners were the prize. Your grandma didn't rush it. She let it set so it wouldn't fall apart, because nothing ruins a rent-week supper faster than it looking sad on the plate. When she cut into it, steam came out like proof. The bite was layered. Soft vegetables underneath, batter on top like a warm cap, pepper and salt holding the whole thing together. If there was any meat at all, it was hidden inside like a surprise, chopped small enough to stretch so every plate could find one little lucky bite. Your grandma had ways of making a pot taste new without buying anything new. One of her best rent-week moves was the brightener, pickle juice. It sounds strange if you didn't grow up with it, but in a 1950s Southern winter kitchen, it made perfect sense. Vinegar wakes up a pot, salt deepens it, and that little tang can make yesterday's beans feel like a different supper, like you changed the whole menu without spending a dime. She heated the beans slow, because rushing beans only makes them taste flat. The pot sat there murmuring, and the kitchen smelled familiar, soft, starchy, warm, like wool coats drying by the door and the last heat of daylight leaving the windows. She stirred from the bottom so nothing stuck, scraping gently like she was protecting the only thing standing between the house and a hungry night. Then she reached for the jar, not with drama, with certainty. Pickle juice went in a little at a time, tasting after each splash. Too much, and it gets harsh, sharp enough to make faces tighten. Just enough, and the whole pot lifts, like you opened a window in the middle of winter and suddenly the air feels clean. Your grandma didn't stop at tang. She added sound because sound changes a room. She sliced onions thin and dropped them into a hot skillet. The crackle started fast, then steadied. The onions went from pale to golden to browned at the edges, and the smell changed everything immediately. Sweet, toasted, almost meaty, like the kitchen had remembered how to be generous. She didn't fry them until they were soft. Soft onions disappear. She fried them until they were crisp, because crisp means people notice. Crisp means the meal feels intentional. Right before serving, she sprinkled those onions on top so they stayed crunchy. The first bite hit in stages: warm beans, then that vinegar tang, then the salty snap of onion like a punctuation mark. It made cornbread taste sweeter. It made plain rice taste richer. It made the whole meal feel awake instead of tired. And it made people talk, because vinegar meals always start opinions. Somebody would say it was perfect. Somebody would say it was too sharp. Your grandma didn't argue much. She just watched who went back for seconds and who quietly took a little more cornbread to balance the bite. Your grandma planned rent week like a chess game. One of her smartest plays was the two-day pot, beans cooked with tomorrow in mind. She didn't just make dinner, she made momentum, because in a 1950s Southern winter, the cold didn't care about your paycheck, and the pantry didn't refill itself just because you wished it would. Day one started the same way every time: beans soaking while the house woke up, then simmering slow until they softened, and the kitchen smelled steady and safe. That smell was its own kind of reassurance: warm starch, pepper in the air, a faint savory note if she had even a little fat to spare. She seasoned with restraint because she knew flavors concentrate overnight: salt late, pepper steady. If there was any meat at all, it was small, an end piece, a bone, a spoon of drippings. just enough to deepen the pot without stealing from the rest of the week. Cornbread came with it, baked in a hot skillet so it got that crisp, browned crust. You could hear the batter hit the grease and sizzle, and for a second it sounded like abundance. Everyone ate, everyone felt fed. But your grandma didn't finish the pot. She protected it. She left enough for tomorrow on purpose, because tomorrow is when the magic happens, and rent week is not the time to be surprised by hunger. Overnight, the beans changed. They thickened, darkened, and settled into themselves. Day 2, the broth clung to the spoon like gravy. The flavors had married. Even the plainest pot tasted richer because time had done what money couldn't. Your grandma reheated them slow so they didn't scorch, stirring from the bottom and scraping the pot with care. The sound told her the truth. Too fast and it sputtered, just right and it gave a low, steady murmur like it was alive again. Then she reheated the cornbread the old way, back in a dry skillet, not the oven. The edges crisped first, then the center warmed, and the smell of toasted corn came back like a memory you could eat. That smell could pull people into the kitchen without a word. She'd break the cornbread open so steam rose up, then set it beside the beans like she was laying down order in the middle of a tight week. Day 2 tasted better than day 1. That's the secret of rent week cooking. Patience turns plain into rich. People who didn't grow up with it don't understand. They think leftovers are a downgrade. Your grandma knew leftovers could be an upgrade if you planned for it, if you cooked with tomorrow in mind. There's a particular kind of winter night your grandma remembered, when rent was finally paid, money was gone, and the week still had days left in it. The house felt quieter after that envelope left her hands, like even the walls understood the trade. That's when she made the end-of-week supper, not because it was glamorous, but because it was honest. It was the meal that said, "We're still here, and we're not going to act scared at the table." She started with broth, whatever she had kept alive through the week. A bone simmered down until it gave up its last good thing. Onions softened into sweetness. Pepper warmed the back of your throat. Salt stayed back until the end, because your grandma didn't waste seasoning on a pot that hadn't earned it yet. The kitchen smelled like quiet endurance. Warm steam, savory depth, a faint sweetness from onion, and that smoky note you only get when something has been cooking long enough to feel like a promise. Then she took bread. Stale was fine, stale was useful. She toasted it hard so it could stand up to heat and not turn to sadness the second liquid touched it. You could hear the crust crack when she split it. You could smell that dry, nutty toast smell pushing back against the cold. She poured broth over the toast in bowls, letting it soften just enough to become tender without collapsing. The bread drank it like it was grateful. If she had anything extra, it went in like a blessing, not an expectation. A spoon of beans saved from the 2-day pot, a bit of rice stuck to the bottom of yesterday's pan, a few greens chopped fine so they looked like more than they were. Nothing in that bowl was there by accident. Everything was there because your grandma refused to let hunger run the house. And then she did the most important part. She cooked something in a skillet, even if it was small, because sound changes a room. A little fried onion, a thin cornmeal cake, a reheated slice of cornbread crisped in dry heat until the edges browned and the kitchen filled with that toasted corn smell. The crackle and the smell told everyone the same thing. Supper is real. Life is still organized.